Gonna sign off, guys. See you later.
Okay.
I'm
Take care,
sure it'll be
bye.
great. Bye.
Sounds good. Bye.
All right. So the recording has started. And we are now broadcasting. So our attendees should be rolling in.
And here they come. Good morning, Amanda. Martina. Hiroya. As you come in, we'd like to welcome you to this next session of the virtual IBC. If you'd like to use the chat feature and tell us where you're from, we'd love to see where you are logging in from this morning, this afternoon, or this evening, whatever time it is. And as you can already see, our panelists are from a variety of places this morning. So please add to the chat. And we'll be starting in roughly 5 minutes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, because I couldn't hear anything and I thought maybe I'd lost my sound.
Nope, you're good.
Okay, okay.
In about a minute.
Welcome, everyone. We still have some attendees joining us. We'll start in just a few moments. Good evening, Melbourne. And David, good point. Thank you. All right, so it's about 1 minute past. We still have some attendees joining us, but we will get started. My name is Peter Doherty. I'm the Executive Director for the International Biometric Office and the IBS, and I'd like to welcome you to today's session of the Virtual International Biometric Conference. This is our first week of the Virtual IBC, and we're very excited. Things are going very well, and this is our third session, and we'll continue through the end of August. Before we begin, we'd like to share a few housekeeping items. First, as you familiarize yourself with the Zoom controls, we recommend that you choose the full screen option for the best view of the session. And in particular, this allows you to easily toggle between a screen that shows the presenter's face and the screen showing any slides being displayed. Second, and as a reminder, this session is being recorded. Attendees will be muted during today's session. However, attendees will have the option to share their reactions using the chat feature and ask questions of our presenters and staff through the Q&A feature. And we ask that all of your questions be sent through the Q&A feature, please. Note that this option is only available during our live IBC sessions. You can also share your reactions before and after the session through the new IBC community, which you have access to automatically because of your IBC registration. So to visit the community, go to ibc2020.org, log into your account, and then click on Communities in the primary navigation. The community also offers more information on future sessions, as well as direct links to each. And in the future, we will also have recordings of all of the previously recorded sessions. Finally, if you experience any technical difficulties with this session or with the IBC community, you can send a message to ibs@biometricsociety.org. This address is being monitored during the presentation and after so that problems may be addressed quickly. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our host and executive editor of Biometrics, Geert Molenberg. Geert?
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you. Also, thanks to Christina for the impeccable organization of this session. As indeed executive editor of Biometrics, it's my great pleasure to be in this very high-profile session, the first of a pair of Biometrics showcase sessions. And to mark the occasion, it's great to see that also the IBS president, Geert Verbeke, and the organizing president, vice president of the IBS, Louise Ryan, are present in the session, as well as so many fine colleagues from all over the globe. Biometrics doesn't need too much introduction, but let me say a few words about it anyway. The journal has been in existence for roughly 3/4 of a century. I think we can say it's a well-established outlet in our profession, not only in the profession, but also read by many of the partnering professions that we work with all the time. It's the sole single-owned journal of the International Biometrics Society next to JABES, the Journal of Agricultural, Biological and Environmental Statistics, which is a publication shared with the American Statistical Association. We receive roughly 650 submissions to the journal every year, and that number is increasing. And I can share with you, it has been increasing dramatically over the past 3 or 4 months. We can all guess why that would be. Our profession seems to be prolific as ever. Of those fine submissions, we managed to publish around 20 to 25% at most. We had 125 papers in 2019, ranging over agricultural, biological methodology, medical applications and methodology, work in environment, work in forestry, bioinformatics, epidemiology, and related fields. Now, what we do every other year in IBC years, and even though this is a special year, it's business as usual in that sense, the co-editors of the journal, and at any point in time there are 3, That is currently Debashis Ghosh for North America, Mark Brewer for Europe, and Alan Welsh from Australia for the rest of the world. They select together with their immediate predecessors, and that would have been Malka Gorfin from Israel in this case. They select one paper from 2019 and one paper from 2018 as the best paper in biometrics. And these are then given an award during a formal award ceremony and showcase session at the IBC, which is now not taking place in Seoul, South Korea, but virtually around the globe. We have actually decided to split up the session into two portions. The first one is today, that's what you're here for, and that's for the 2019 paper. The one relating to 2018, and that's a paper by John Rice, Rob Stroderman, and Brent Johnson. That session is scheduled for August 18. I'm sure that's all on your calendars, but let me turn to today's session and paper now. We are absolutely delighted that the award for 2019 goes to Andrew Chappell and Peter Toll on a paper entitled A Hybrid Phase 1, 2, 3 Clinical Trial Design Allowing Dose Re-Optimization in Phase 3. Peter and Andrew actually don't need too much introduction, but let me say a few words about them anyway. Peter is a well-known authority, a very well-known authority from MD Anderson in Houston, Texas, who has won numerous awards for his work, his methodological and applied work in many areas, but predominantly also Bayesian methodology in clinical trials. Andrew worked with Peter while in Houston, not at MD Anderson, but close at Rice University, and with also links to MD Anderson. Currently, he's located in Louisiana at Louisiana State University Health Center, based in the city of New Orleans. As we go, feel free to ask questions during the presentation. Normally we don't do that, but we consider that a little bit rude, but here you can do it in the chat. I will keep track of the questions so that we can smoothly move into the Q&A sessions right after the presentation given by Andrew, with Peter Toll also in the back seat for the presentation. So Andrew, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Gert, and thank you, Peter, for the introductions. And I'd like to thank IBS for this award and this opportunity to present what we think, at least, is really important research, and hopefully will change the way that people think about clinical trials. So the title of my talk is going to be a little different from the title of the actual paper. I'm going to be discussing a new hybrid phase 1/2-3 clinical trial design. And again, this is joint work with Dr. Peter Thal from MD Anderson. I did this whenever I was at Rice during my PhD. And this is an idea that Peter actually was thinking about for a long time, and I was lucky enough to be the person that he got to hand it off to. So to start out, I just want to talk a little bit about heterosis. And heterosis is the tendency of a crossbred individual to show qualities superior to those of both parents. So here's a Labradoodle, right? It's a mix between a lab and a poodle. And interestingly, whenever I was looking a little more into heterosis, I found this reference down at the bottom, studying dogs in England. And it showed that dogs that were crossbred actually lived about 1.2 years more on average. So we're going to be introducing a sort of hybridized version of the clinical trials that we all know and love. So I'm going to talk about an introduction. The introduction is actually really going to set up our motivation. It's a little more important than I think a lot of introductions in talks. I'm going to talk a little bit about the statistical model that we use, some of the trial conduct decisions, some of the trial outcomes that you could have, and then finally, ending with a simulation study, which really shows how effective this approach is. So again, this talk is based on a paper that appeared in Biometrics in 2019. It also had discussion, two nice discussion papers, and we had a rejoinder that we really are proud of. So a little bit of background. Clinical trials aim to find some kind of optimal dose of a new experimental agent, which we're going to denote A throughout the talk. And we want to improve patient survival or progression-free survival compared to some standard control therapy denoted C. So usually this is done in 3 phases. In phase 1, you pick an optimal dose, which we'll call X-opt of A, which is based on toxicity. So usually that's the maximum tolerated dose. That's the dose the highest dose level that's deemed safe for patients. And then phase 2 will determine if the response rate of A, X-opt, so that's why I have this parenthesis here, is promising. And finally, in phase 3, randomized comparison of the dose that you picked in phase 1 of that agent A compared to the control therapy based on survival time. Alternatively, phase 1/2 designs make that first decision on dosing based on both efficacy and toxicity to choose X-opt. The big idea that we're going to present here is we're going to hybridize a phase 1/2 and a phase 3 trial by allowing our design to re-optimize the dose during that first part of phase 3 based on patient survival. So here's just a schematic of the conventional treatment paradigm. So in phase 1 or phase 1/2, we have capital J doses of this agent A. And let's say, for example, we pick X2 at the end of phase 1. Then we're going to take that off to phase 3, and we're going to test the null hypothesis that the mean survival time of the agent A treated at dose level X2 is the same as the control versus an alternative that either the control or the experimental agent itself has some delta improvement in survival time, some target improvement, could be like 12 months. And usually people will do a group sequential design where you're going to have decisions for superiority or futility at various interim looks. So here's just another schematic of how the phase 1/2 to 3 and phase 1/2 to 3 approaches differ. So in phase 1, we're going to choose a dose based on YT, which is our indicator of short-term toxicity. And then we're going to go to phase 2, and we're going to verify that this actually has therapeutic benefit based on YE, which is some short-term efficacy indicator, which could be something like tumor shrinkage. And then we're going to go to phase 3, which is a randomized comparison of the dose we picked in phase 1 compared to the control therapy C in terms of YS. The other alternative, which we argue is way more appropriate, is using a phase 1/2 design, where you're actually simultaneously going to find a dose level that optimizes or that has reasonably safe toxicity probabilities based on YT and reasonably high efficacy probabilities based on YE. Still though, when you pick that dose and you go to phase 3, you're going to do a randomized comparison. So if possibly short-term efficacy not connected to long-term survival that much, then your dose that you pick in phase 1/2 could possibly be suboptimal. And I have this paper here down at the bottom by Aerosmith 2011, and they say that about 50% of phase 3 trial give negative results in that they don't actually have a therapeutic benefit. And one of the reasons that this paper suggested that that's the case is because of suboptimal doses. So we're picking the wrong XJ to go forward to phase 3. So this motivates our whole idea here. So in a phase 1/2-3 trial, so it's a hybridization of a phase 1/2 and a phase 3 trial, we separate things off into stages because we are talking about phases here. In stage 1, you're going to do your traditional phase 1/2 trial. So that includes adaptively assigning patients to the doses and picking a dose that's optimal. In stage 2, we're going to start phase 3 the same way as we would traditionally. So we're going to randomize patients between that arm that we picked at the dose level and the control until we see N2 patient deaths. And then at that point, we're going to look at all of the data for every single patient that's been treated with A. So that's all the patients treated in phase 3 at the dose level we picked from phase 1/2, and all of the patient data from phase 1/2 that were treated. And we can follow them forward. Those phase 1/2 patients, we can follow them forward in terms of survival time. So whenever I denote this data set here, what I'm saying is data at the bottom. I've got a MathCal D set 1, 2, 2. This is the phase 1/2 patient data at stage 2. So this is additional follow-up time, additional survival time that we can follow these patients for. And at this point, I'm going to look at all patient data, right? Their efficacy indicators, their toxicity indicators, and most importantly, their survival time. And I'm going to re-optimize the dose that maximizes patient survival time. I'm going to call this thing X hat S opt. So it's my estimated optimal dose in terms of survival time. And then I'm going to finish the trial through stages 3 to K, doing group sequential looks between A of the dose I re-optimized to and the control. So here's just 2 examples on how this might work schematically. So in phase 1/2, let's say I've got 5 doses here. And at the end of phase 1/2, I pick dose X4 as my optimal dose. So I'm going to go and I'm going to start phase 3, and I'm going to randomize patients between A of X4 and the control. So this is in our stage 2 portion. And if our data suggests that actually dose level X3 had the best mean survival time, I'm going to from A of X4 to A of X3. And then I'm not going to look at patient data that were treated at A of X4 during phase 3 any longer. I'm just going to throw that data out. And I'm going to continue randomizing patients between the new dose that I've re-optimized to and the control therapy. And at the end of the trial, then I'll make my decisions based on the new dose that I re-optimized to and the control. So I am going to get slightly more control patients from this way because I've thrown out sort of that first portion of experimental patients. Another example here, I picked dose level X3 and I'm going to start running my trial. And if the data suggests that X3 does have the best mean survival time in terms of A, then I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. I'm not going to switch doses at all. So that's just the conventional paradigm. But the strength is really in this first example, right? Where we incorrectly pick, or we pick a dose that is not optimal in terms of survival, we have the opportunity to switch back to it. Whereas here, the design, the model, the algorithm is smart enough to not switch off of this. So as far as our models, we are going to model survival time as a mixture over the 4 binary bivariate outcomes that could happen. So a patient could have toxicity and not efficacy. They could have efficacy and not toxicity. They could have neither efficacy or toxicity within some time window, like a month. And then they could have neither of both. So if we're modeling over these 4 binary bivariate probabilities, we're going to model the survival time distribution. So this is f of s given ET as a function of the dose that we pick, A of X, the efficacy status of this patient short term, and the toxicity status of this patient short term. Because the assumption is, right, if you have a tumor shrinkage, that your survival time should increase. Likewise, if your toxicity is a heart attack, then your survival time would decrease. And then we have these probabilities here, this pi. These are going to be a function of the dose level. So we're going to model those 4 binary bivariate events as a function of the dose level. And that gives us our whole PDF, our whole survival time distribution. Likewise, we can get our mean survival time averaged over these 4 binary bivariate events by computing the mean survival time given each efficacy and toxicity status and multiplying by those corresponding probabilities as a function of each dose. So we're going to calculate this mu s A of X for all of the doses that we have in the trial. And then we're going to switch to the dose that has the largest value of this. For our model, for modeling the toxicity probabilities, those binary bivariate toxicity probabilities, we're going to use the FTOX design of Thal and Cook. And again, this is going to denote that probability of the 2 binary bivariate events as a function of X. And we're going to assume, right, that the toxicity probability, the logit of the toxicity probability, can be modeled linearly with dose. And we're going to put a prior on this tau T2 truncated above 0 to ensure that as the dose level increases, the toxicity probability must increase. And that's one of the basic assumptions of phase 1 trials. Likewise, we're going to assume that the efficacy probability is a quadratic function of dose, which gives us a little more flexibility and allows for the possibility that, you know, a middle dose is actually more effective than the highest dose or the lowest dose. And then we're going to connect these two marginal probabilities of efficacy and toxicity together via this cupola here. It's I think it's a Morgan-Gumbelson cupola, and it has this extra parameter psi here, which is going to kind of move the mass of the marginal toxicity and efficacy probabilities to those 4 binary bivariate cells. So here's our parameter vector in terms of our binary bivariate probabilities, and we're going to have priors on all of these. They're actually going to be informative based on clinician beliefs, mainly for the phase 1-2 portion of the trial. For our survival model, we're going to model the hazard of death given our dose level, status, and toxicity status as a Cox type model. So this H0 of T, I'm going to talk about a little bit on the next slide. So this is our baseline hazard. And then we're going to multiply this thing by the exponent of a quadratic function of dose to allow, again, the possibility that the middle dose is the best in terms of mean survival, or the highest dose or the lowest dose. We're going to subtract off x of beta E times YE, because if a patient has efficacy, it should decrease their hazard of death. Likewise, if a patient has toxicity, it should increase the hazard of death. And we're going to put normal priors on these with a variance of 100 and a mean of 0 on these betas. So for our piecewise hazard, we're going to use our baseline. We're going to use a very flexible piecewise exponential hazard that also has reversible jump capabilities. So I have some of the details down here, but I just want to explain in words using these graphs. So essentially what we're going to assume is this is a plot. These black lines here are true hazards. And I basically drew some data from these hazards and then fit these piecewise exponential hazard models to them. So we assume that the hazard pieces, the number of pieces, is actually random. So if you look at the left side, I have 2 hazard draws from this posterior distribution. Each of them have 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces. And on the right side, I have 2 pieces. So the number of pieces themselves is a random variable that can move via reversible jump Metropolis Hastings move. We're also going to assume that given the number of pieces, the locations of these pieces is also random. So we're going to allow our posterior to move these for us. And likewise, the heights of these pieces are random. So in terms of trial conduct, we have really 2 portions of the trial. We have our phase 1-2 portion and our phase 3 portion. Our phase 3 portion is going to consist of stages 2 all the way up to K. Our phase 1-2 portion is just going to be stage 1. So in phase 1-2, we're going to adaptively assign doses to patient cohorts as they come in, and it's going to maximize estimated posterior mean desirability, which I'll talk about on the next couple slides. It's a real valued function of efficacy and toxicity probabilities. And we want to assign patients to the dose that has that highest value. Now, we can only assign patients to doses that have acceptably high efficacy probability and acceptably low toxicity probability. Now, one wrinkle that we have here is after some burn-in period during phase 1-2, we're going to start adaptively randomizing patients among the acceptable doses. And I'll explain a little bit more later, but the reason we did that is we found that if we didn't do adaptive randomization, we wouldn't have enough patients spread among doses in certain trials that allow us to switch correctly to the optimal dose in terms of survival time. Our phase 3 part of the trial, which is stages 2 all the way through K, first we're going to re-optimize the dose of A at the first decision. That's stage 2. That's our innovation. Then we're just going to do a group sequential trial till the end. We're going to stop the trial and declare A or C to be superior. That's our re-optimize for superiority. Or we're going to stop the trial early and declare neither to be superior, which is our futility decision. So in terms of dose acceptability during phase 1-2, we're only going to deem a dose acceptable if here we're saying that the posterior probability that the efficacy probability is higher than this threshold, pi e, is reasonably high. So this, somebody might set this pi e to be 0.3, which means that I'm not going to assign anyone to doses that don't have estimated efficacy probabilities that are substantially above 0.3. So that's this threshold here. And likewise for toxicity, I'm not going to assign patient to doses unless they have the posterior probability that the toxicity probability at that dose being below some threshold, maybe like 0.4, is reasonably high. So this is for patient safety here. These bars, pi t bar and pi e underscore, these are set by a clinician. These two here, PT and PE, these are operating parameters, trial parameters. So these can be adjusted so that the trial has desirable operating characteristics under different scenarios. Now, if a dose level XJ is not acceptably non-toxic and acceptably efficacious, we can't assign a patient to that dose. During dose assignment, we have this function phi. So this function phi, if you're interested in it, you can read the 2004 FTOX paper, but it's a real valued function of the estimated efficacy probabilities and the estimated toxicity probabilities. At the end of phase 1/2, we're going to bring forth this dose, which we're going to call XET opt hat, because it's estimated, right? And this is going to be the dose level, it's an argmax of XJ that maximizes phi of the expected, so these are the posterior mean efficacy probabilities and the posterior mean toxicity probabilities at each dose. And this is at the end of the phase 1/2 portion of the trial. And throughout the first part of phase 1/2, we're going to adaptively assign patients based on this criteria as well. Now, after a certain point, we're going to start doing an adaptive randomization. And the reason is phase 1/2 trials have greedy sequential optimization. So you could get stuck assigning patients to a suboptimal dose in terms of YS. And it's even possible that you could assign patients to a dose that's suboptimal in terms of YE and YT. This is a stickiness or an exploration versus exploitation problem. So now we're going to introduce this NF. So after NF patients have been enrolled during the phase 1/2, we're going to randomize patients to dose level XJ, provided it's acceptable with this probability here. Now, phi j is going to be the posterior mean desirability of dose J. This set Q is going to be the set of all posterior mean desirabilities that are acceptable. And I know this function maybe looks kind of weird, but the rationale for it was this still favors randomization to the dose level that has the highest posterior mean utility, but it sort of falls off. Like if there's a dose level that's very close to being optimal in terms of that, those two are going to get the highest mass. So it doesn't allow a high probability of randomization to dose levels that have a far less posterior mean desirability than the optimal dose at that given point. Another thing we want to consider are these phase 3 group sequential parameters. So these you can get from EAST or some other kind of group sequential software. So we need to specify our maximum sample size, NS, our null mean survival time, what we think the control is, our delta, which is our desired improvement, our type 1 error, and our power, and our desired information proportions. And if you use a software like EAST, that will give you these group sequential sample sizes, and it'll also give you stopping boundaries for futility, which will denote U1 to U big K, and for, that's for superiority, and for futility, it'll be L1 to L big K. So at each given look, we're going to calculate the log rank statistic just in the same way as the usual group sequential, and we're going to stop the trial if the absolute value of the log rank statistic is bigger than UK for superiority, and we're going to stop the trial if the absolute value of the log rank statistic is less than LK for futility. And if we set LK equal to 0, then there's going to be no futility looks at that point. Some additional parameters here that come into play is the length of the phase 1/2 outcome window. So the longer that patients are followed during phase 1/2, the more survival time you're going to get. Also, the waiting time between the end of phase 1/2 and start 3. If, for example, you run a phase 1/2 trial and you wait a year, you're going to be able to collect a lot more information on survival time from those patients, and also the expected accrual rates. The last thing that's really important is this N2 star, which is that first sort of stage, that first interim look. It's the number of patient deaths before we decide to re-optimize. So that's another important parameter here. And I want to finish off this section with this really great graph that Zhao and G 2019 made to discuss our paper. And this just kind of puts everything together. So in this here, they wrote sort of, we got stage 1, stage 2, stages 3 through K. They have the phase 1, 2, the phase 3 portion. And here's basically each patient, we're going to follow them until death, which would be an X, or censoring, which would be a square. So in this first portion, I'm just going to adaptively assign patients to different doses. So I've assigned patient to dose 1, dose 2, dose 3, dose 4. And the second stage, I'm going to start adaptive randomization in that second portion. So I'm going to adaptively randomize here and here. At the end of stage 1, I picked XET hat opt as optimal. So this is the second dose. I'm choosing that as optimal. I'm going to start assigning patients to this dose, randomization, these blue dots down at the bottom, and the control during the beginning of phase 3. Now, after I get to N2 star deaths, I'm going to look at all my data of patients treated with agent A. So if you look at this, right, I've got a couple patients that were treated at X2. 2 of them died, 1 was censored. And then in my phase 3 portion, by this time, 2 out of the 3 phase 3 people that were treated at X2 have died. But if I look at X3, I have 2 people that were treated during that first stage of the trial, or 2 cohorts that were treated. And 1 has been censored before I'm making my decision. And the other one has not yet died. So they're going to be considered censored at this decision. And you can see these bars are a lot longer, right, than the ones at X2. So now I'm going to say, hey, based on survival, actually, the optimum dose that I should use is dose 3. So now this is going to be my XS hat opt. And I'm going to finish the trial randomizing patients between dose level X3 and the control. So I really like this graph, and I think it does summarize things. Now, before I get into simulations, I want to just spend 3 slides talking about possible true conditions and trial decisions. So I've already introduced some of this notation, but let's talk about truths. So I've got XET opt. This is going to be my truly optimal dose in terms of that desirability function. My XET opt hat, that's the dose that I picked at the end of phase 3. I have phase 1, 2. So it's possible, right, that I didn't pick the correct dose, the correct optimal dose. Likewise, I got XS opt, that's the truly optimal dose in terms of survival, and XS opt hat, that's the re-optimized dose. So there's some probability, right, that I'm not going to correctly choose these true doses. Now, this is a slide that that Dr. Thal put in, and I think it's a big point. So it's rocket science. That's that the truly optimal doses, based on that phi function and the mean survival time, they might be the same, they might be different. So it's possible, right, that the dose that's optimal in terms of phase 1, 2 is the dose that maximizes survival. It's also possible that it's not. And then also, if we do pick the right dose correctly, do we actually declare that dose level superior to the control for our experimental agent? So here's just a few possible trial outcomes. This is sort of looking at, did we pick the right dose in terms of phase 1, 2? And this is, did we pick the right dose? Is 2 dose optimal in terms of survival? So in this case here, we picked the right dose in phase 1, 2, and it's optimal. So in this case, our hybridized design cannot actually provide benefit compared to the standard protocol. We picked the right thing, we should just run with it. But our design does not switch away from this dose. So that's a key. In the second case, we picked the right dose in terms of phase 1, 2, but that's not the one that maximizes survival. So our method can actually switch to that dose. In the third case, we don't pick the right dose in terms of phase 1, 2 criteria. But if we had, it would have been the one that maximizes patient survival. This also gives us a benefit here. And then lastly, we have a case where the dose we picked is not the optimal, and the optimal dose also does not match the optimal dose in terms of survival. And we can switch to that dose, XS opt, with a higher probability. So our simulation study, I think, really shows just how powerful this method is, this idea of switching. So what we're going to do is we're going to perform a 2-sided test of, we're going to compare the control to the agent, the XJ that we picked. We're going to assume that the mean is 24 months, mean survival time, versus the alternative that one of them is 12 months higher. So we're looking for a 36-month survival time. The raw dose levels that we're going to consider here are 1, 2, 3, 3.5, and 5. We're going to run a phase 3 trial with 500 patients, assuming 10 patients accrued per month, and a phase 1/2 sample size of 60 patients, assuming 5 patients per month. We're going to start adaptively randomized patients in phase 1/2 after 15 patients have been enrolled. These are the parameters we use to kind of construct that phi function. In phase 1/2, we're only going to allow enrolling patients at doses that have toxicity probabilities that are substantially below 0.4 and efficacy probabilities that are above 0.3. And we're going to decide to switch or we're going to actually re-optimize after 50 patient deaths during phase 3. So another things, we're going to assume that there's a 1 month window in terms of evaluating efficacy and toxicity, and a 1 month wait between phases 1, 2, and 3. So again, if this window was longer, we actually should have an even higher probability of switching to correct doses because we have more survival time on these patients. And we calibrated our design to have type 1 error, 0.05, and a power of 0.8 for our group sequential look. We're going to do 3 group sequential decisions. So we have K equals 5 total. So stage 1 again is phase 1/2. Stage 2 is that re-optimization step. Stage 3, 4, and 5 are group sequential looks. We use each software, and we determine that we want to look at, we want to make superiority decisions after 200 deaths, 300 deaths, and 400 patient deaths. And we're going to use these superiority bounds here and these futility bounds, which means we're only going to make a futility decision at that second interim look in the group sequential trial, so after 300 deaths. All right, so this is a setup of our simulation scenarios. Now, the big thing I want you to look at is over here. So over here, what we did actually is we did an exponential distribution. We assumed that all our data was exponentially distributed because the log rank test assumes that your data is exponentially distributed, and it has a linear term of this form. So we have a function of dose, we have a efficacy event here, and we have a toxicity event here as well. And we have some probabilities at each dose for efficacy and toxicity probability that we're not going to list here, but those show up in terms of what dose is optimal in terms of XET. This is the phase 1/2 criteria, and XS-opt. For each scenario of these 6 scenarios, we're going to make a null case where 1 dose is equal to the control in terms of 24 months. So you can see that here, like dose 5 is optimal, is 24 months. And then an alternative case where that same dose, whichever is the highest, that has the same mean survival time as the control, has a bigger than delta improvement. So this is a 36.2 month mean survival time, a 36-month mean survival time, a 38-month mean survival time, another 38-month mean survival time. This is dose 1. This scenario here, we have 2 doses that actually have a higher mean survival time than 36 months, and same here. So this table here is going to express kind of the different scenarios. In scenario 1, if we pick the right dose at the end of phase 1/2, we don't want to switch. The doses that's optimal in terms of phase 1/2 is also optimal in terms of phase 3. In scenario 2, we have the same thing. We don't want to switch. Scenario 3, we do want to switch from dose 5 to dose 3 if we correctly pick dose 5. Scenario 4, we also want to switch from dose 2 to dose 1. In scenario 5, we want to switch from dose 2 to dose 3 or 4, but dose 3 maximizes patient survival. You get a 44-month patient mean survival time versus a 38.6-month mean survival time. So we call the probability in case 5, where we pick dose 3, a generalized power event. So we picked the best dose we could possibly pick, and we declared it better than the control. And same for scenario 6. We have dose 3 is optimal in terms of phase 1/2, and we'd like to switch to dose 4, but dose 5 also gives us a treatment advance. Okay, so this is our simulation results. This is the kicker. So gamma 1 and gamma 2, again, gamma 1 is that probability of picking the best dose and declaring it better, and gamma 2 is the probability of picking any dose that is delta better than the control and declaring it better. So gamma 1 and gamma 2 are going to be equal for the first 4 scenarios where there's only 1 dose, and gamma 1 and gamma 2 are going to be non-equal for the next scenarios. So here I have phase 1/2 arrow phase 3. This is the conventional paradigm compared to our hybridized approach. So if you look at phase 1 or scenario 1, our power goes from 0.29 in the conventional case to 0.83. That is an enormous improvement already off the bat. I would even say that this 0.66 to 0.09 improvement in power, this is also pretty substantial just from that simple stopping rule. In scenario 3, we go from 0.06 generalized power for the conventional paradigm to 0.79, which is very drastic. Same in scenario 4, we have a 0.17 improvement in that generalized power. For scenario 5, where we have 2 doses that are actually better than the control, we have an increase of picking the best one, the best dose, from 0.21 to 0.68. And again, declaring it better than the control. That's the key. So we're basically saying, this study has been a success. This drug is actually better than what we've been treating at this dose. And likewise, we have a huge increase in probability of selecting either of those two, from 0.25 to 0.88. And you can see the same thing for that last scenario, right? We have about a 0.25 improvement of picking the best dose and declaring it optimal, and about a 0.23 improvement picking either of the better doses and declaring it optimal. And under the null, the only thing I really want to focus on is this alpha. So you can notice, right, if you're worried about type 1 error, all the type 1 errors are constrained for the phase 1, 2, 3 design. And another thing I want to focus in on is this W bar. So the W bar is if we run the trial and we pick a treatment that is better than the control, and we start giving patients that treatment at that dose, what is their true improvement in survival time? What's the true improvement in survival time for future patients by making that decision? And so I subtract that off. We average over those decisions. So in the phase 1, 2, 3 paradigm, we go from a expected 4-month improvement in future patient outcomes compared to a 10-month improvement. And this is pretty striking, right? We go from a 1.83 improvement in patient survival for future patients to an 11.51. And again, that's just a function of, in this conventional paradigm, we're barely picking the right dose and saying it's better, right? But we're doing that a lot more in the second case. And that dose that's better actually does have a 12-month improvement in survival. Okay, so just a summary of the simulation results. So the phase 1, 2, 3 hybrid design has a much higher generalized power. And again, that's the probability that we pick the right dose in terms of mean survival, and we declare it superior to the control compared to the conventional paradigm. It does treat about 30 more patients on average. You can see that here, right? These null hypotheses, we do have some higher sample sizes for that hybridized approach. And you can think about, for the null hypotheses, why that's the case. So when I'm running my group sequential comparison with futility, if I throw out patients when I switch, so in a null hypothesis, right, I'm going to switch to this dose here and then compare this dose to the control. So if I was on one of these doses, it would be more likely that I could stop the trial and say, hey, look, this is actually no better than the control. And it controls our type 1 error probability. So it soothes the fear of people terrified by type 1 errors. Now, again, one other thing we looked at what happens if we raise our phase 1, 2 sample size from 60 to 90. So just a small bump in that phase 1, 2 sample size, which should give us, if you think about it, more exploration on the doses, which should allow us to switch better in terms of our optimization. And we can see in the first scenario, we have a 0.05 increase in generalized power. In the second scenario, we have a 0.09 increase in generalized power. Same with the third one, we have a 0.09 increase. We have a 0.04 increase in scenario 4, a 0.13 increase in scenario 5 for generalized power, and we also have an increase in picking either dose. And in scenario 6, we have a 0.08 increase in generalized power and a 0.15 increase in the probability of selecting either dose as optimal. So by having a bigger phase 1, 2 sample size, we're more able to switch to the dose that truly optimizes patient survival. And just to assuage any fears, we did a robustness study. So we simulated data according to a Weibull distribution, a gamma distribution, and a log normal distribution. For each of these distributions, we had them made that we set parameters to where the mean survival times, the true mean survival times, were either equal to 24, the highest one, or the highest one was bigger than 36, so that they're truly a null or alternative case. And because the baseline hazard has this flexible piecewise exponential distribution, the design performance didn't change across the board for these different distributions. Under all distributions considered, the phase 1/2-3 paradigm was far superior to the conventional paradigm. So again, just to wrap things up, the phase 1/2-3 design, it is drastically superior to the conventional protocol. Just for a simple idea of, hey, look, we've already collected a lot of patient data during phase 1/2 at these different doses. We've already started collecting patient data in phase 3. What if we use all that patient data to possibly re-optimize our dose based on what we really care about, which is patient survival? Now, we'll also say that this thing would perform even better compared to the traditional protocol, phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3. And the reason for that is after phase 1, when you pick a dose that is acceptably toxic, you could possibly, in phase 2, have a decision to not continue, right? So that dose that you picked does not demonstrate enough efficacy in that phase 2 portion. And we had further improved operating characteristics when our phase 1/2 sample size increased, which makes sense. And I want to finish right with saying that if you're interested in using this design, I have a package available. It's phase 1/2-3. It's on CRAN. I think it's pretty extensive, but if you are interested in doing something like this for simulating or actually conducting the design, I'm definitely happy to help. And we are currently working on some extensions to this. So that's it for my talk. I'd like to thank everybody for listening.
Thank you, Andrew. And please join me in congratulating and thanking Andrew and Peter for their excellent work. We have received a few questions. Let me read the first one for you, Andrew or Peter. Somebody says, is there any difference between the mean survival time for patients and the median survival time?
So that's not something that we did look at. I mean, there could be. I will point out that one issue that comes from this kind of piecewise exponential approach here, one possible issue is because this thing is fit from 0 to the maximum observed patient time, it's possible that based on this, that there is not a median for a given posterior iteration.
A question that I had since the beginning, and you touched upon it right at the end of your talk, Andrew, is personalized medicine. I was wondering how would it tie in, how would it connect to that, I mean, growing body of research? Now you say you're working on that. That sounds very exciting, but maybe also very difficult. Maybe you don't want to expose the crown jewels yet, but could you say a few words about that?
Sure, absolutely. So you could imagine when I'm thinking of personalized medicine here, I'm not talking about a big biomarker vector. I'm more talking about, you know, does patient A have this biomarker, this biomarker, this biomarker? But you could imagine, right, maybe 4 subgroups of patients defined on some kind of genetic characteristics, where we're going to run the phase 1/2 trial within each patient group. And maybe we'll borrow strength among these groups to make dose decisions. Afterwards, we're going to go forth to phase 3 with all 4 groups. And with all 4 groups, when we're going to make that re-optimization step, we can borrow strength from those phase 1/2 outcomes for that entire trial and those phase 3 outcomes for the entire trial.
I think that, can you hear me?
Absolutely, Peter.
In this regard, I think it's worthwhile to mention that I've done some work with Thomas Murray in the past in which we had subgroup specific decisions in a randomized trial with ordinal outcomes, looking at postoperative morbidity. That took the subgroups that were given at the beginning as sort of fixed. And at the moment, Andrew and Tom Murray and I are working on an extension of that allows you to let the data tell you whether the subgroups you were given are as suggested or not. So it allows you to collapse subgroups. And this sort of idea of collapsing subgroups actually is based on an idea that Andrew had in a completely different paper in which we were doing phase 1 dose finding. It uses latent variables in a multi-level hierarchical model. That's a separate issue, but it's quite important.
Yeah.
Because taking subgroups as they're given to you, it turns out, is not as sensible as allowing the data to tell you what the subgroups actually are in terms of treatment effects.
And you can imagine using that same framework on, if you did have a biomarker vector, which you wanted to determine different patient subgroups, like an enrichment group, you could use that total same structure.
That's a vastly harder problem. The whole enrichment design area is extremely difficult.
Yeah.
Because you've got to map a very high dimensional vector to a subvector, define subgroups, and make decisions. And so that's embedded in all of this stuff. It's quite a challenging set of problems.
It does sound that there is still quite a bit of interesting work to be done. Yet, at the same time, I think many people will be very charmed by the idea of gaining time and money, of course, also. In the current time segment, do you think that your ideas, your designs should be used, should have been used already? I mean, COVID-19 related, of course. I mean, what do you have to say on that?
So actually, Peter and I have talked about this a little bit. So I don't know. I definitely think that a different version of this would have been very useful for COVID-19 research right now. But, when we're talking about time to death for these patients, when we're talking about cancer trials, we're talking about, 8 to 20 months, something like that. For COVID, if you make it past that 30-day mark, you're probably not going to pass, I guess. So I don't know how much benefit that extra sort of survival following makes a difference. Your short-term efficacy events in that case is just 1 month did you live, right? Like, at least that's the way that a lot of the trials that are getting positive results are looking at.
Now, in that case, there is also...
I should mention in this regard that if you look at this as a modular kind of thinking, first of all, you can swap out any other phase 1/2 design you like if you're willing to rewrite your code. But the other thing is that in this particular paper, in this method, we're optimizing dose, which is a quantitative thing. But you could replace dose with, say, 3 qualitatively different treatments where you're doing screening. And you could decide in the beginning that treatment 2 out of 3 is the best, and then continue, and later on decide, we made a mistake, actually treatment 3 is the best. That goes all the way back to the select and test designs that are over 3 decades old, but it refines it by allowing you to make up for having made a mistake early on. So the thinking can be generalized in a number of directions, and that last way would be quite useful in the COVID-19 setting, where I've had many people come to me with all sorts of different treatments for people that had ARDS, whatever, in the ICU. And it occurred to me that what we really needed to do was screening and then comparison, but we haven't done that. Nobody's wanted to go into that set of designs. They want something that's sort of vanilla and conventional.
Yeah.
And I think that this really just hits at, the way that clinical trials are conducted, right? We have to have small sample sizes when we're doing that first decision process. And so it totally makes sense to leverage that information going forward.
Okay, I think interesting talk and interesting discussion. Thanks again, both. And I now am glad to hand over the word to Geert Verbeke, IBS President.
Thank you very much, Geert. So indeed, as president, it's really a pleasure for me to welcome you all to this session, which, as you've heard already, was supposed to be part of our International Biometric Conference, which was supposed to take place earlier, actually this week in Seoul. However, because of the COVID-19 issue, the meeting had to be cancelled. all people involved in the planning of the original meeting joined forces, and they set up a virtual program containing various aspects of the original program, and that new virtual program will be spread over the entire summer. So I really would like to thank everyone involved in setting up this virtual program. It's become tradition to have a biometric showcase session at each IBC, and Geert already mentioned that. And during that session, the two best papers in biometrics published by an IBS member, one for each of the two preceding years, are then presented. As a society, we very much welcome the selection of those papers, as we believe this is the best kind of publicity for the research conducted by our members. So I really would like to take the opportunity to thank the executive editor, Geert Molenberg, but also the team of current and some former co-editors for making the selection. This is very much appreciated. I also would like to thank Geert for agreeing to offer the biometric showcase session at our virtual program. The paper that we have just listened to and that has just been presented was selected as the best paper for 2019. So I really would like to extend my congratulations to both authors and thank you, Andrew, for presenting the paper. I'm very happy to confer upon you and Peter the award of Best Paper Published in Biometrics in 2019 by an IBS member. In usual circumstances, if we had been able to meet in Seoul, I would now hand over a certificate to you. And of course, obviously, this is not possible now, but I can guarantee you the certificate will be mailed to you later on. So congratulations again on behalf of the entire society and of course also the biometrics editors. I would like to conclude here by thanking you all for attending and by inviting you to participate in future online meetings later this summer. And I'm really happy to hand over to Peter Doherty for closing this session. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Geert, and congratulations to Andrew and Peter as well. A wonderful paper. Thank you for sharing it. A great presentation. And we hope everyone had their questions answered. If there are any questions that occur to you, which you'd like to share later, you can go to the online IBC 2020 community and post your questions there, and they will be addressed. You can also keep up with the conference via the Society's Facebook, Twitter, or LinkedIn social media accounts. Links to all of these platforms can be found at the bottom of the IBS homepage, biometricsociety.org. And shortly, we'll be adding those links to the IBC 2020 site as well. On Monday, July 13th, our second keynote address will be given by David Donahoe, plus much more throughout the week. So be sure to visit ibc2020.org, check the latest schedule, and double check the time zone listed for each session. Many, but not all, sessions will probably be available to you in a live setting, and we hope you can join us that way. Thanks again for joining us today, and you may now disconnect from this session. Bye-bye.